Hi, welcome or welcome back. My name is Eleanor, and this week I started quite unexpectedly by finding this in my local library. It's a new book that just came out called Gliff by Aldous Smith. I had seen it in the bookstore a few days earlier and decided not to buy it on two counts. It looked like a bit of a slight book. I should say I haven't read anything by Aldous Smith. I know that she's a huge name. She's a huge British writer, but I picked it up and it looked very slight, and I didn't think it was the sort of thing that I wanted to buy as a hardback. Now, it does have a beautiful cover. I mean, that's absolutely stunning and so clever. And the back, of course, has that painting reproduced. But it felt almost as if the cake wasn't so good, and so they had to put really beautiful icing on it, which I know is really unfair, but I always go with my gut feeling. So I didn't buy it, found it in the library, rushed home and read it just out of curiosity because, Aldous Smith is such a huge name. And I will say at first I was really disappointed. I thought it was very superficial. I thought the story was cliche. I realize that Aldous Smith is working with tropes of dystopia. There are siblings who are called Briar and Rose. So there's a play on fairy tales, and there's an attempt at a type of social criticism. There's the setup of nature versus industrialization. I didn't really get into it. And this was really, I wasn't even going to talk about it because I thought, well, what's the point? It's just not for me. But then, I thought about it for a little bit longer. And things started to change. And I wonder if this is how Aldous Smith books work. I don't know, but this is what happened to me. So I started thinking about the horse that is at the center of the story. And it reminded me of a certain time in my childhood as a girl, as a pre-teen girl. I was entranced by horses. Now, not the real horses, but horses in books and also in movies. And I know that is actually something that happens, well, at least in my generation, it happened to a lot of girls, and I think it's still continuing to this day. There's a certain mythology about young girls and horses and a connection. And that made me also think about the connection between horses and humanity at large. And because the book is set up in extremes, I remembered reading Black Beauty as a girl, and also the idea, the concept that you learn in history class of how society changed so drastically when automobiles were invented and horses were no longer needed for transportation. And this somehow started me thinking about the mythology of being a young person, especially a girl, and in this case Rose is a girl. Her older sibling, Briar, it's not specified what gender Briar is, but in any case, there is a certain childhood tradition of this connection. And then I thought of other childhood literary traditions that are connected to me personally, and possibly to other people who've had maybe, similar upbringing in similar societies. I thought of the Grimm fairy tales, and I went to I have this book. It's Philip Pullman's Fairy Tales, and they call it a New English Version. I find that it's good for research. And he starts in his introduction to quote an American poet by chance, James Merrill, and he says that James Merrill singles out, I'm quoting here, two of the most important characteristics of the fairy tale as he sees it: the serene anonymous voice in which it's told, and the conventional stock figures who inhabit it. And there is a kind of serene anonymous voice that shows up in Gliff, and it's certainly got the conventional stock figures. And so I continued reading a little bit more about what Pullman says. He says there's no, quoting again, there's no psychology in a fairy tale. The characters have little interior life. Their motives are clear and obvious. If people are good, they are good, and if bad, they're bad. And so that explains something that, it put me off about Gliff, that it's so extreme. You're either really good or really bad, like society and the rules of the government, bad. Industrialization, bad. Technology, bad. Children left to their own devices, good. Nature, good. Horses, good. So the very thing that put me off and made me dislike the book was in fact what Ali Smith was trying to create, and that changed everything for me. And I'm very glad I looked into it deeper. Now, it also took me down a rabbit hole, which I think is important. And I'm wondering, I don't know if this is what Ali Smith had in mind, but with my background and my experience with literature in my childhood, my young girl mythology that I loved, I find a lot of connections actually to Gliff. And it wasn't while reading it, I should say, it was only while thinking about it. So in a strange way, the reading of it was devoid of emotion for me, somewhat annoying and boring. But my thoughts afterwards have been so interesting. I've been so fascinated by the connections I've been able to make. So there must be something that Ali Smith is doing for that to happen. Now, what I'm talking about is certain types of books that I really loved and that are also produced specifically for young people, but also especially young girls, I think. Now, first, to get the fairy tale aspect out of the way, the Grimm stories definitely have so many connections to this story. Well, especially the story of Sleeping Beauty. And that's obvious from the names of the siblings, Briar and Rose. And then there's this idea that these two siblings, they have a stepfather. Their mother is missing. So they're basically, left to their own devices. This happens over and over again in children's literature. And it's not only in this oral tradition that has come down through the Brothers Grimm. It's also, now that I think about it, in the books that I most loved as a young girl. So, for example, the Noel Streatfeild books that I loved, like ballet shoes or theater shoes or tennis shoes, for example. Most of the time, these children, for whatever reason, had absent parents. They were fending for themselves. This also happens in, for example, the Railway Children in Nesbit. Their father, there's 3 children. Their father is accused of being a spy, somewhat similar to what happens in Gliff. They have to fend for themselves. There's a connection to the railroad, which again has links to what happens in Gliff. I don't want to say too much. There are going to be no spoilers here. Then there is the tradition of boarding school stories. And of course, you're thinking Harry Potter, and yes, the tradition continues to this day. The books that I was passionate about when I was a preteen girl usually had these young children in boarding schools. And so Enid Blyton had, I think it was the Mallory Towers series. Antonia Forrest, I mean, the Marlowe family. When I did the research for this and I came up with all of these book covers, I almost burst into tears out of happiness, nostalgic happiness, because I spent so many hours reading these books and pretending I was in these scenarios. And I can't really explain why, because I mean, I had a very happy family home, or, I never went to boarding school. I never wanted to, but I was interested in that. And obviously writers for people my age at that time, and probably now too, because of Harry Potter, they know what to do. And it's a kind of tradition. It's a literary tradition. And it's important to pay attention to that, I think. Then there's The Secret Garden, which is by Frances Hodgson Burnett. And there you have this discovery of one garden and then an even more secret garden. And then there's a character called Colin in it. And that immediately reminded me of a character called Colon in Ali Smith's book. And it also reminded me of this magical place where nature is still available to these children, and that they find themselves in the school of Sacobanda, sixth form college, this old abandoned school for all intents and purposes. So what we've got here is a really fascinating notion that somehow the character of Rose, through her connection and love to the horse Gliff, and the things she does later on, the things her older sibling does, and the stories within the story that are told in this book in italics. I think there's 3 separate stories told in italics. There's this idea that Gliff is looking back to the history of childhood and the history of childhood mythology and literature, and possibly the idea that it will perhaps be lost. Just as the caves, I think there's caves somewhere in France where there's prehistoric drawings of horses, just as you might look at those prehistoric horses drawn on the walls and wonder what life was like. You might one day hear a story of a girl with a horse and wonder what life was like. Now, this changes everything for me. This really changes everything for me. And I was pushed to reread this book and found many points of interest that I hadn't noticed before. I haven't had this experience with a work of fiction before. It's quite odd. At first I thought, it's just sort of Easter eggs. Ali Smith is leaving little hints and allusions. And is this the case where I'm like, oh, aren't I clever? I discovered what happened in 1868 when she mentions 1868. And I know the history of the automobile, or I know, the history of the electoral history of England or something. It's much of a muchness. I think it is that, but it's more than that. And I think I see what she's doing, and I've surprised myself by really liking it against my better judgment. Because, I mean, honestly, it's not as if the story is saying anything new. And it is a bit tedious to hear about how bad technology is, how bad the internet is, blah, 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 how awful the government is. I mean, it's very black and white, but I mean, it's a fairy tale. Now, also, I mean, the blurb itself on the back of the book, it really put me off because I'll quote from the blurb actually. It's not Gliff is a novel about how we make meaning and how we are made meaningless. Blah 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 blah. I mean, everyone is saying all this all the time. Every book is about how amazing words are, and words have so many meanings, and that's not very interesting. And I mean, the meaning of Gliff in this book, it's given there's a chapter that just has a list of all the different possible definitions of Gliff. Boring, boring, boring. And yet I'm still intrigued by something in this book, despite all of that. I'll also mention a connection which is not boring. Well, okay, so there's a connection to the quote, "Oh, brave new world," the Shakespeare quote from The Tempest. But it's really more about, it's really more connection and an allusion to Brave New World by Huxley. And now I have this book in my library, and I hadn't read it. And so I was pushed to read it, and I'm halfway through, and I'm absolutely loving it. I had no idea that Brave New World was all about bringing up children. How do you bring up children and babies? And so I'm finding that fascinating. But the way Ali Smith presents the connection to Brave New World in here is deadly dull. She does this really, I mean, it's really rather pathetic wordplay on the three words Brave New World. So she'll have rave new old, or rave no, and there's a few others. That's another one. Avenir. I find that really, really tedious because I come from the world of poetry, and poets do this much better than prose writers, and yet despite that, I'm finding an interest in it, and it's also introduced me to Brave New World, which I'm very thankful for, because I didn't really want to pick it up before. I didn't know what it was, that it was going to be so fantastic. So, yeah. I do recommend this book. I still wouldn't buy it. I still don't think it's good enough to purchase and keep on my shelf. But I'm very curious about the second. It's part of a duology. The second part is going to come out next year, and I think it's going to be Gliff YPH, and pointing towards something to do with writing. I'm really curious to see if this is sort of more of a prequel to something much more fascinating. So in any case, I hope you've been well. I want to remind you that the only real property is the property of the mind. And leave a comment about what you think, if you've read Gliff, or if you've had any of these experiences as a young person reading these kind of tropes or myths. I'm not really sure what to call them. My very favorite film when I was that age was International Velvet, which had those tropes, which had the preteen girl who loses her parents. She moves in with aunt and uncle in the middle of nowhere. she falls in love with the horse, etc., etc. So I'll leave links below just for the fun of it, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.